All right, this is our third and last of the evolution of behavior lectures. And on this final one, we're going to talk about um, natural selection, variation, and how we can see these behaviors evolve over time. So I've picked a few. One I'm going to spend some time on, you're going to see some videos, is on learning a little bit and intelligence of ravens. I worked with a raven and a crow at the LA Zoo, and we can talk about that in our class discussion. But what happens is they're very intelligent creatures, and our next grouping is going to be, we're going to talk about neurobiology and hormones. So I think it's kind of interesting. So I picked this as kind of a sample organism. But what happens is variation happens. And again, this is genetics, which will be 2 lectures from now. And we're going to look at this variation having fitness consequences. We talked about fitness in an earlier video. So one of the things that R.H. Fisher looked at was how ravens looked at new and novel things. Now, obviously, organisms have fear. We saw that with foxes. What they found is how quickly a raven would approach something new. And so they were going to look at how would this behavior work with natural selection. And so what they found, which is really quite interesting, is the ravens that were slower to approach had fewer eggs. And which, again, everybody gets to breed. That's that differential reproduction I mentioned. But the ones that are better adapted are the ones that are leaving more offspring. And here we're talking eggs, and not all eggs are going to hatch. But reality is, if you've got that and you're laying more eggs, and chances are that you're going to be able to raise more young, you're going to see a population that is going to get less fearless and approach things at a quicker rate. Now, it may get too fast where everything new and the bird gets taken out, and that's not beneficial. So there's a happy medium. But what Fisher found is what they think was happening is the birds that were able to approach or did approach things quicker were able to find new food sources for their young. So they're actually to give them more food, give them a better chance of survival, a better chance to get become an adult, and a better chance then to have the ability to find a mate and breed. So again, this is a natural selection variation in genetics, who's more fearful. And over time, this works for ravens. The fact that they are a little more intelligent, a little more able to deal with new things, gave them an advantage. And so over generations, you saw ravens being less scared of new novel things. Okay, so what is phylogeny of behavior? Let's start with phylogeny. Now there's no behavior on here. What we're looking at is a couple of different ways to draw phylogenetic trees. These are what they call cladograms, not important. But you've all seen kind of how the evolutionary trees they used to do. That's classical trees. They don't do that as much anymore. This is the new standard. And what they're trying to do is show relationships. So you have the root, that would be the ancestor of all these species. And then you see things branching off as they evolve through time. And so when we do these phylogenies, they're typically done morphologically. They're looking at physical structures that they share. Today we're doing with DNA genetics. We're looking at DNA sequencing. So science has gotten very technical. But the idea is that we know these are related. Here's the characteristics we think they had. There are primitive characteristics like in vertebrates, where all vertebrates have backbones. So that is a primitive characteristic in us. A more advanced characteristic in us would be hair and mammary glands. That's why we're mammals. Again, if you look here, you can see the mammals right there, and they got us. If you look, with snakes, turtles, crocodilians, and birds, all of these guys have backbones. That's a primitive characteristic. Birds have feathers. That would be a derived character. So anyway, so that's kind of the idea behind this. Well, what I want to do is take this a step further and not just look at physical things, but behavior. And so what you're saying is, when we mentioned this before, George John Romaines, get it right? We talked about his book, and he talked about phylogeny behavior, and these are balloon flies. And so the question is, why would we see a balloon fly today where the male would give her an empty balloon? There's nothing inside there, but that is an accepted gift, and she lets the male copulate. So you look at that behavior, and it's like, why would you take a shiny object with nothing in it or have no real value and accept it? And it makes no sense. But there is a bunch of different species of balloon flies, and if you look at the different behaviors, you can see how something like this could evolve. And so the primitive or typical balloon fly, actually, there's no balloon at all. So the earliest ones, they believe, basically the male comes in to breed, and chances of him getting eaten are high. So the idea was either he gets eaten or he gets to have sex. And so as a male, it's kind of maybe a 50-50 what's the word I'm looking for? Choice. I don't know. But not good. So we also saw balloon flies then. One male got smart and thought, hey, if she's hungry and she's going to eat me, maybe I'll just give her a gift of the fly. So he caught a fly and he gives it to her, and while she's eating, he has sex. So it's a distraction. It's a gift. Then there are other balloon flies that say, hey, you know what? You give her the gift, but then the timing's a factor. You've got to get done with your business before she finishes and turns and eats you too. So these balloon flies then started wrapping the prey item, which then takes longer for the female to open and eat, and so they would most likely survive that copulation. And then there are some males that thought, well, screw getting the fly. That's a lot of work. I'm just going to make a balloon and give it to her. And so it's an empty gift. So so guys in the class, or even females, if you're thinking you want sex, you're going to give your partner a very fancy a gift, and they open it later and they're like, hey, I had sex with you. I got an empty box. Oh, the gift is the box. So good luck with that. That may be why you'll become single. But kind of an interesting concept. So you can see the behavior evolve, and the first two behaviors there makes sense. You know, the last one kind of is kind of unique in the sense that there's no longer that food source inside. But excuse me, but that balloon is needed for the female to copulate. So, and again, we have balloon flies today that do all of these different ones, so different species. So this is how we interpret the behavior. So the pelicaniformes is pelicans and some other birds, boobies, cormorants, anahingas. So quite a few. And this picture is not great, and you might have to blow it up when you take a look at the PowerPoints. And I'm not going to hold you to all the different behaviors they have. But what you're saying is you could go out and try to get this behavior data of all these species and splice it together, but that is extremely hard to do. So what most people do is they start with the morphological beliefs of who's related, kind of what we did before, that first slide I showed you on this topic. And then they superimpose the behaviors they know these birds do to try to figure out what is a primitive trait and what is a more derived trait. So what I want you to kind of key in on, maybe on this, is you look down here and you can see these two here are probably the most primitive traits. And because it looks like everybody across this grouping who are related to each other have that behavior. And you can see this is probably the third one. And then you have some that only a couple have, and these are the more derived characteristics. These are the ones that showed up. So you can tell that the ones on the very ends that are the most, and I got my face right above this last guy, but you can see the ones that are on the ends are the ones that have the least in common with each other because they are evolved, their common ancestor happened a long time ago. All right, and so here's kind of the concept. So what they would set up, and these are just 10 random species, and they're looking at a couple of different behaviors, whether they're nocturnal or diurnal, which means do they spend time at night or during the day. And then arboreal means they're in trees, and terrestrial means on the ground. So what they did is they took 10 species and they just asked the question, what are you? Where do you spend most of your time? Is it awake at night, awake during the day, or is it in a tree, or is it on the ground? Then they took a group of organisms and did the phylogenetic tree due to morphology, not to the behaviors, to morphology. And you kind of, you see that. And then what they did is they kind of overlap them. And here then they're looking at, and what you see is that 4, 5, 6, and 7 are the ones that are nocturnal and arboreal. And they think the primitive state is the presumed ancestral state is diurnal and terrestrial. And then what they did notice is that 4, 5, 6, and 7 were the opposite. They were nocturnal and they were arboreal. And so what they think happened is in this break here, it evolved, and probably 2 different genes, or maybe even multiple genes that we're not aware of. So at one point during the evolution of these behaviors, it became advantageous, and now we see it in the split. So instead of evolving 4 different times, they think it evolved once in an ancestor that then split. All right, and then the last example we'll give for this week will be sleep. We're going to talk about sleep later, and sleep has had a lot of, what does sleep do for us? We all need sleep. It turns out that they've done experiments, and if you do not sleep, you die. Your body just shuts down. They've done this with rats. And they've done experiments, and we'll talk about this stuff, but they would give them a slight shock anytime they would try to go to sleep, and eventually it killed them. They just couldn't handle. So it was once thought that sleep was correlated to body size. Maybe bigger animals needed more sleep, and it turned out that was not true. Matter of fact, it got to the point where some of that it was negatively correlated. So another theory suggested it was with learning and memory, specifically memory consolidation. And that's pretty recent, and still believe that we sleep because we need all the stuff that comes in during the day. Sleep allows us to decide what's important, put it in the right place in the brain to store, to make those neural networks, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will shortly. And so that was another thing. So we expected the brain to show that. And what it found out is the brain didn't. So the things that have been linked to this, though, and we haven't talked about it, but there is a part of the brain, the amygdala, depending on how you want to pronounce that. What they came up with is, although the brain was not showing this as size or convolution or anything, there's a small part of the brain, which we'll talk about next week, the amygdala, that actually does show a correlation between size and non-REM, that's the rapid eye movement, sleep in mammals. So you can see that there is this correlation. So maybe it's not as important in the brain itself, but maybe there is a structure within the brain that is showing some correlation. The other correlation that was shown in a different study was the more sleep that people, or mammals got, it wasn't people, mammals, was also correlated with immune response and parasites. So the top graph up there shows that basically the more sleep you got, the more white blood cells you would make, which is helpful in our immune response. So sleep might have to do with keeping you healthy. On the same token, there was a negative correlation on the bottom for parasites. It turned out if the more you slept, the less parasites you had in mammals. And so what I'm trying to share with this is behavior is tough. We're not really sure. You know, we look at the behaviors, we try to describe it, we try to look for links. And so you can see, and I'm going to go back real quick, you can see, you know, sleep was thought to do body size. They started studying that. No, that doesn't seem to be true. Learning and consolidating memory, well, we didn't see that in the brain, but now all of a sudden, well, there's a part of the brain that kind of does that. And we'll, again, talk about the amygdala next week. And then maybe it's immune response and parasite response and health, so you can have more offspring and fitness. We don't know, and maybe it's both, and that's the problem. Behavior is so complex. Maybe both of these are driving. Maybe it's a third thing we haven't even thought of yet, and that's why behavior is not taught. It's difficult, and then number two, it's hard to kind of limit, especially in wild studies, to limit all the variables, all the factors. Nothing's in a vacuum, and so everything is being pressured and pushed, and sometimes things that we're looking at may have nothing to do with the behavior we're talking about. It's just a random chance that they kind of correlate. So hopefully we're looking forward to doing this. I'm going to semester and just realize that behavior is a very difficult topic. And so hopefully we can have some fun with that. So I will stop recording.